In 1723, Bach took up his appointment as the cantor, musical director of St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig. And he wasn't the first choice candidate. They really wanted Telemann to succeed Kuhnau, who had been the predecessor there and had just died. But Telemann didn't want the job, and so they went down to the next level and asked Graupner if he would take on the job, and he couldn't be released from his post. And so they had words with each other and said, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to go to the mediocre level and we'll appoint Bach. And so, unfortunately, they considered they were appointing a mediocre composer. And I think, in a way, they didn't have a terribly good relationship with Bach during his time there. But, of course, luckily for us, Bach is a great composer. And during that period at St. Thomas's, he wrote a great deal of music which we treasure. And we're performing the Christmas Oratorio in a few days' time. The job was actually a very onerous one. He was in charge of music at St. Thomas's, but also at the sister church St. Nicholas, and also in two other churches where he was responsible for the music that went on there. And the music that goes on there is organ playing, obviously, although he can't have been at all the churches all the time. But he had to write a cantata, a choral piece for each of the Sundays of the church's year, and also festival days as well. And we know that he was very enthusiastic when he took up his post and set off on writing a cycle of cantatas for the year. And we know that he started at least 3 cycles of cantatas. And we have remaining now over 200 of them. Obviously, lots have been lost. And I suppose he could recycle them and perform them in different years if the texts were relevant. Now, I've called them cantatas. That's not quite what Bach would have called them, although he did use that title occasionally. What he would put on his manuscript is actually the title of the piece, the words of the opening chorus, and then the Sunday or the date that it was for, and then the year. And I call it a cantata because it's a sung piece. It's normally for choir and also for soloists with orchestral accompaniment. And while I think of it, I mean, Bach was in charge of teaching everybody their music, fixing all the players, and in fact Bach had to teach the boys Latin as well, although after a couple of years he was relieved of those duties. And a cantata lasted 20 or 30 minutes and would be somewhere in the service around the time of the Creed and would reflect on the text, probably of the Gospel, but certainly the text of the Mass of that day, the service of that day. And these cantatas normally started with a big chorus, something quite elaborate, sometimes based on a chorale melody, but not always. And then through a series of recitatives and arias for the various voices that Bach wanted to score for or had at his disposal, those movements would reflect on the text. And the poems were often written by a man called Picander, and we know that he helped Bach put together the Christmas Oratorio. And the piece would end normally with a chorale, a hymn tune, rather straightforwardly written, normally just for 4 voices, 4-part choir. And we think that probably the congregation could join in. We don't know if they did or not, but certainly they would recognise the tune at the end of a cantata. And on 3 occasions, Bach didn't call them cantatas, he called them oratorios, and there's a reason for this. And the 3 of them are the Ascension Oratorio, the Easter Oratorio, and this Christmas Oratorio, which is a cycle of 6 cantatas. And the Ascension Oratorio, when the collected works of Bach began to come out in print in the 1800s, early 1800s I think it was numbered cantata number 11. So in fact has missed out on this title Oratorio. The Easter Oratorio stands on its own and is a slightly longer work than the 30 minutes we expect from a cantata for the normal Sundays. And so when it came to the Christmas Oratorio, and we're talking now about 1734 into 35, when Bach puts these 6 pieces together, he obviously wanted to write 6 self-contained pieces that would make a unifying whole. And there was a bit of a rush to do that, and so he recycles a lot of his old music, and that's fair enough because there's no copyright, he can use what he likes. People have perhaps not heard his music before, so he could recycle it. And we think some of the movements are based, particularly the choral movements, based on instrumental pieces, because lots of the choral writing is really quite elaborate and instrumental. And the 6 cantatas were written for the 3 days of Christmas, 25, 26, 27, and then for New Year's Day, and then that's how it fell in this particular year for Bach, and then the Sunday after New Year's Day, and the 6th one for the Feast of the Epiphany. Now this word oratorio was used on these 3 occasions, Ascension, Easter and Christmas, because there's a narrator, an evangelist if you like, and if you think of the Matthew and John Passions, they have the tenor telling the story, the Bible story, from words from the Gospels. And so that exactly the same happens here in the Christmas Oratorio. The text is from Luke and Matthew telling the Christmas story. And then the various arias, and there are quite a few short arioso sections, contemplative sections, as well as the big arias themselves. And they, through the 6 cantatas, tell the whole Christmas story. They're incredibly, and of course they weren't intended, Bach never intended them to be performed in one evening. And you can hear, if I've said 30-minute long, each of them, not quite, but that sort of length, they are a bit too long for an evening's performance. And so I've made some judicious cuts so that we can have the flavour of each of the cantatas. You will hear the bulk of each of the cantatas by missing out 1 or 2 of the arias on the way. So we will perform the piece complete. And the cantatas are incredibly varied. Although I've said they form normally a shape, and most of them do, 5 of them do, they begin with the big chorus and end with a chorale. The second one doesn't, because this is representing the shepherds coming to the stable, and it begins with a pastoral symphony. And rather cleverly at the end, when the chorale comes, Bach elaborates the chorale with instrumental music that uses the same music from that pastoral symphony. Trumpets and drums are there in the 1st, 3rd and 6th cantata, and that's quite right for the time of year. You want something really triumphant and uplifting, and you perhaps know, lots of us will know the opening chorus are Christians be joyful, and we are singing in that rather old Troutbeck translation, because it is wonderfully faithful to the spirit of the piece. So cantata 1, big chorus at the beginning, and when we get to the end, the chorale again is elaborated with trumpets and drums playing. The second cantata, beginning as it does with the pastoral symphony, might well have lost its big chorus, but no, Bach puts the big chorus in as we sing Glory to God in the highest, and that's the big elaborate chorus in part 2. Part 3 is slightly unusual in that it begins with a fairly short choral number, and then we go through a series of arias and recitatives, and when we come to the final chorale, Bach says, repeat the opening number. And so that first chorus is repeated at the end to make a shape. Cantata number 4 is scored for horns, and so the trumpets have now gone and the horns take their place, and so again you can tell that Bach didn't intend them to be performed all in one evening. He would have made sure the orchestration fitted rather better, but we are including Cantata 4 with its 4 horns and a different sound world. Cantata 5 doesn't have trumpets and drums, and then the trumpets and drums come back in for Cantata 6, which has an elaborate opening chorus, and then a final chorale, which again is elaborately scored with the trumpet solo doing very decorative things on top. Probably worth saying that pastoral symphony is slightly unusual in that Bach calls for 4 reed instruments, 2 oboe-d'amores and 2 oboe-toccaccias, and it's in that 12/8 pastoral mood, a bit like the pastoral symphony in Messiah. And so the whole evening will be an elaborate combination of these 6 cantatas, all with wonderful variety in shape, and the words telling the Christmas story, but also contemplating on them.